Western civilization. How much do you know? My name is Russell Miles, and this is the 14th episode in our Western civilization series. In the previous episode, we defined what is meant by disease, viruses, bacteria, and the plague, and we looked at the earliest pandemics that impacted upon the West. In this episode, we're going to look at how people responded to disease, the Black Death, and the change in attitudes towards pandemics in the West.
Plague or epidemics require close urban living and trade or large-scale movement of peoples to spread. In the Middle Ages, cities and towns would experience a wide range of diseases with seasonal epidemics and major epidemics every decade or so. The diseases included leprosy, bubonic plague, smallpox, tuberculosis, scabies, erysipelas, an infection of the skin, anthrax, trachoma, measles, sweating sickness or influenza, cholera, typhus, and syphilis. With the growth of trade between Asia and Europe, pandemics came to impact upon societies unfamiliar with new diseases and having less immunity. This included the Justinian plague 541 to 542 CE with reoccurrences until 750 CE. The number of deaths is uncertain, perhaps between 30 and 50 million, as it spread across Asia, North Africa, Arabia and Europe. The origins of the Justinian plague are believed to be Central Asia and a bacteria called Yersinia pestis. In the early 1340s, bubonic plague struck China and swept through India, Persia, Syria, Egypt, and then by the Sicilian port of Messina to Europe. The Black Death caused the deaths of 25 million across Asia and would kill more than 20 million people in Europe, 1/3 of the population. Medieval physicians' belief held that the cause of plague was Bacillus messina, or corruption of the air. This theory of epidemics was found in Hippocrates, which had been elaborated by Galen, a Greek physician who investigated the Antioch plague, and which is sometimes referred to as the Plague of Galen. This theory was further expanded upon by Ibn Sina, Avicenna, a Persian philosopher and physician in the late 9th century. This advice saw the clearing of rubbish from streets and attempts at improving the air in plague-stricken towns, along with quarantining practices and restricting travel. There is more information about social reaction to the Black Death than earlier pandemics. There were many people who believed the Black Death was divine punishment. A part of the context was the final loss of Jerusalem by European forces in 1270. There was also the biblical focus on death and a apocalyptic teaching. The Messiah's return to punish the wicked and save the faithful. The Mongol Empire at its height in the 13th century under Batu Khan, the Good Khan, stretched from China to Eastern Europe to the Sea of Japan, northward to the Arctic, the Indian subcontinent, Southeast Asia and the Iranian Plateau. The Mongol Empire's control allowed unimpeded transit of the Silk Road and a boom to trade between the East and West. This also allowed the Black Death to rapidly infect widespread populations. To seek God's salvation, some people turned on Jewish communities and other alien groups, lepers, gravediggers, social outcasts, Muslims. There were 60 major and 150 minor Jewish communities destroyed, including 2,000 Jews burnt alive on Valentine's Day massacre in Strasbourg, 1349. Thousands of Jews fled to the relative safety of Eastern Europe, particularly the Kingdom of Poland. Pope Clement VI sought to prevent violence, issuing 2 papal bulls in 1348 saying that those who blamed the plague on Jews had been seduced by that liar, the devil. Flagellants were a cult of pious young men whom travelled from town to town, engaging in public displays of penance and punishment, beating themselves and one another with heavy leather straps studded with sharp pieces of metal. Pope Clement condemned the flagellants too. The impact of the Black Death was massive. There was such a horrendous death toll that the global population was in decline for over a century, as much due to the decline in fertility as families were unable or unwilling to have children. England and Norway were estimated to have lost 2/3 of their population. A few places were little affected for reasons still not understood, including Poland, parts of Hungary, parts of what is now the Netherlands and Belgium. Remote areas such as the Pyrenees were also spared. Sumptuary laws were: A. mandating the eating of meat and poultry to encourage the livestock industry. B. Stipulating what type and colour of clothing could be worn according to class. C. The encouragement of the consumption of beer to wean dependency on gin. Or D. Granting civil and political rights to peasantry. Kings and rulers reacted to food shortages by price controls of produce and labour and prohibited food exports. This compounded the economic downward spiral and heightened inflation and depression. With large tracts of agricultural land idle, farming moved from grain to livestock, with a corresponding increase in meat and dairy products among the peasantry. In Western Europe, peasants' share of income increased along with political influence. Serfdom declined in places, whereas in Eastern Europe kings placed more savage strictures on the peasant class. Rulers and the nobility reacted by instigating what were termed sumptuary laws to limit the conspicuous consumption of the prosperous peasants, traders and skilled workers. These included regulating purchases of meat and dictating what type and colour of clothing to a person of various classes. These laws were difficult to enforce as militias also found better paying work. In 1527, the bubonic plague emerged in Wittenberg, Germany, then home of Martin Luther. The Elector of Saxony ordered the then famous Martin Luther to leave. However, Martin Luther stayed in Wittenberg with his family, opened his house as a ward for the sick. Martin Luther offered that it was not necessarily wrong to flee from death, and no one should dare leave his neighbour unless there are others who will take care of the sick in their stead and nurse them. He also argued to maintain hospitals staffed with people to take care of the sick. As mentioned in previous episodes, Martin Luther would not have considered Jews and others who displeased God to be his neighbours. The inclination for social isolation as a means of protection is long-standing. This originally arose in response to the spread of leprosy. The Lord struck the king, and he was a leper to the day of his death, and he lived in a separate house. 2 Kings 15:5. The philosopher and physician Ibn Sina had recommended patients with infectious diseases, especially tuberculosis, be kept away from others. The period of isolation was initially a fortnight, 14 days, and gradually was increased to 40 days. This period seems to have had the inspiration of the Bible, where 40 is considered a sacred number, meaning a long time, with references including 40 years in the wilderness, 40 days of Moses on Mount Sinai, 40 days of Jesus being tempted by Satan. The term quarantine comes from the Venetian quarantinia, meaning 40 days, which was used during the Black Death pandemic to designate the period ships must remain isolated before passengers and crew could go ashore. The period of 40 days probably developed as folk observed less infection after this time period. It also allowed seasons to warm, so less disease. Dancing mania was a social phenomenon that occurred primarily in mainland Europe between the 8th and 17th century, when it abruptly stopped. It involved large groups of people dancing erratically. It is unclear whether it was an illness or a social phenomenon. One theory is that the victims suffered from ergot poisoning, which caused hallucinations and convulsions.
In our next podcast, we're going to look at other cultures' responses to disease and the impact on Indigenous people in the age of exploration and conquest. In the meanwhile, consider if Islamic teaching about plague is A, an opportunity from God for Muslims to make evident their faith, B, retribution by God on the unfaithful, C, Muslims must not enter and must leave plague-afflicted land, or D, in Syria in 638, the Caliphate was victorious over plague-affected Byzantine forces. If you like this channel, please subscribe and tick like. Let me know what you think in the comments below, and I can be contacted on email russmills@iprimus.com.au. Thanks for listening.